Most people don't associate religion with trauma, at least not right away. When we hear the word trauma, we tend to think of war zones, car accidents, or abuse, the physical kind, the visible kind. But psychological trauma doesn't always come from violence. Sometimes it comes from belief. More specifically, from being raised inside a framework that defines what's real, what's good, what's wrong, and what happens to you if you ever step outside that framework. And when that belief system is wrapped in divine authority, protected from criticism and reinforced through family, culture, and fear, that trauma can cut deep, but it doesn't always leave bruises. That's why it's often missed. Someone grows up believing in hell, in eternal punishment, in divine surveillance. They believe their thoughts can condemn them. Their doubts make them unworthy. Their identity is broken by default. On the surface, they might seem fine. They go to school, smile at dinner, do what's expected. But underneath, they're carrying something heavy. A sense that they can never really be enough, that love is conditional, that punishment is eternal, that their body is sinful, their questions are dangerous, and their instincts can't be trusted. This isn't just guilt. It's not just shame. It's a kind of psychological conditioning that wires the brain to associate normal human thoughts and emotions with fear and judgment. And over time, that wiring becomes trauma. Not everyone who grows up religious ends up traumatized. That's important to say, but for those who do, it's not because they were weak. It's because their environment treated fear as virtue, treated obedience as safety, treated submission as moral success. And when that's all you've known since childhood, you don't just walk away clean. People who leave high-control religions often struggle for years with anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts, even symptoms of PTSD. Not because they're making it up, but because their minds were shaped by systems that trained them to feel fear where none was needed. Take the doctrine of hell, for example. It's one of the most psychologically damaging ideas ever created. Eternal torture. Not just death, not just consequence, but endless, conscious suffering. Often for the crime of disbelief. Children are taught this, not metaphorically, literally. They're told that their friends, their neighbors, even family members could be burning forever, and that it's their fault if they don't try to save them. That's not moral education. That's psychological manipulation, and it stays with people. Even long after they stop believing, many still have nightmares, panic attacks, sudden waves of dread. They can understand, rationally, that there's no fire waiting for them, but their nervous system doesn't respond to logic. It responds to years of repetition. This is where the term religious trauma becomes essential, because it gives language to something that for too long didn't have a name. It validates the experience of people who left religion and found that the hardest part wasn't leaving the community or the belief system or even the doctrine. It was what that belief system did to their mind and to their ability to trust themselves. Think about what happens when a child is told over and over that their thoughts can be sinful, that their feelings are a test, that their doubts are an attack, that being human, angry, curious, sexual, independent is the very thing that makes them broken. That child grows up learning to disconnect. They learn to monitor themselves constantly, to distrust their impulses, to shut down parts of their personality. And not for safety, but for salvation. That's not spiritual growth. That's self-alienation. And it doesn't stay confined to religious spaces. It bleeds into relationships, into work, into how people view their worth. It creates a mindset where control feels like love, where suffering feels like purpose, where being small feels like being safe. And when someone starts to unravel that, when they begin to deconstruct those beliefs, the process can be painful, because they're not just changing opinions, they're changing the way they think, the way they feel safe in the world. And for many, that shift brings a kind of grief that's hard to explain. Not just grief for lost time, but grief for a version of themselves they never got to become. A version that didn't grow up afraid of their own thoughts, that didn't have to earn love, that wasn't told their body was a temptation or their identity a sin. This kind of trauma is often hidden because it wears the costume of devotion. It hides behind words like discipline, faithfulness, righteousness. But underneath those words, there's often a deep, chronic fear. A fear that you are never good enough, that your failure is your identity, that love will be withdrawn if you stop believing, stop obeying, stop performing. And when those messages are framed as divine truth, they're almost impossible to argue with. That's what makes religious trauma so uniquely damaging. It doesn't just come from a parent or a teacher or a system. It's said to come from the ultimate authority, from God, which means questioning it isn't just rebellion, it's betrayal. That's a recipe for psychological harm. And yet, many people suffer in silence, because in religious communities the trauma is often invisible. It's reframed as growth, or testing, or discipline. You're not traumatized, you're being refined. You're not depressed, you're under spiritual attack. You don't need therapy, you need more faith. So people don't get help. They pray harder, they fast, they confess, they beg, and when that doesn't work, they assume the problem is them. But it's not. The problem isn't that people are broken, it's that they were told they were broken and then punished for acting like it. That damage doesn't go away just because someone stops believing. Leaving religion is only the first step. Healing from it takes time. It takes language, it takes support from people who understand what it means to untangle identity from ideology. And more that support is becoming available. People are sharing their stories. Therapists are starting to recognize religious trauma as real. Resources are emerging, books, communities, recovery programs. And slowly the silence is being replaced by conversation. That conversation matters because it allows people to hear, maybe for the first time, that what they experienced wasn't just strict parenting or a demanding culture or tough love. It was trauma. And naming it doesn't mean blaming. It means understanding how systems built on fear, even if they're well-meaning, can do real harm, and how people can recover, not by finding new beliefs to cling to, but by rebuilding trust in themselves. That's where the healing starts. Rebuilding that trust isn't simple, because when someone has internalized the idea that they can't rely on their own thoughts, feelings, or moral instincts, they often don't know where to start. They were taught that external authority is the source of truth, that guidance comes from above, from a book, a leader, a doctrine, not from within. Though when those structures collapse, it's not just freedom they're left with, it's confusion, disorientation, a void. And the temptation, especially in the early stages of leaving religion, is to fill that void immediately, to grab onto another system, another set of rules, something to tell them what's right and what's wrong. But healing from religious trauma doesn't mean replacing one rigid system with another. It means learning how to think and feel for yourself, without fear. And that's slow work. It means questioning old assumptions, letting go of guilt that no longer applies, learning that discomfort isn't danger, that doubt isn't failure, that saying, "I don't know," doesn't make you weak. It means unlearning the reflex to apologize for existing. And that can take years. Because religious trauma isn't just about what was said, it's about how it made you feel, how it shaped your nervous system, how it trained you to shrink, to perform, to suppress. Even when the doctrine is long gone, the imprint remains. That imprint can show up in small, quiet ways. Someone feels anxious every time they skip a routine, or guilty when they enjoy something that used to be forbidden, or ashamed when they say something honest that would have once been called blasphemy. These aren't just habits, they're symptoms of a mind that was trained to fear itself. And part of recovery is learning to make peace with that mind, to let it breathe, to stop framing every stray thought as a battle between good and evil, to just be. That sounds simple, but for people who grew up being told they had a sinful nature, or that their heart was deceitful, or that their desires were traps, neutrality can feel like rebellion. Peace can feel suspicious, because for years they were told that struggle is holy, that suffering is redemptive, that obedience is love. But in reality, obedience isn't love, it's just control. And love, real love, doesn't require fear. It doesn't punish honesty. It doesn't demand erasure of self. Yet that's what many people were taught under the label of religion, that submission equals virtue, that silence equals strength, that saying no to yourself is the highest form of goodness. And when that message comes from everyone around you, your family, your community, your sacred texts, it's hard to question, because you're not just disagreeing with an idea. You're stepping outside the only reality you've ever known, and that's terrifying. That fear doesn't disappear overnight. Even if the beliefs are gone, the habits often stay. The self-policing, the guilt, the urge to justify your existence. But over time, those habits can fade, especially when people start to talk about them. That's why open conversation is so important. Not debate, not argument, just stories. Shared honestly, without shame. Because in those stories, people hear echoes of themselves. They realize they're not uniquely broken. That others had the same doubts, the same fears, the same moments of waking up in the middle of the night, terrified of a God they no longer believed in. And that realization is often the turning point. Not when someone discovers a new philosophy or a counter-argument or a historical critique, but when they realize they're not alone, that their pain is part of a larger pattern, that the harm they experienced wasn't personal failure, it was predictable. It followed a script, a system. And if the harm came from a system, then maybe the healing can come from stepping outside that system. Not into another belief, but into freedom. Freedom to feel, to question, to exist without justification. That's what healing from religious trauma really looks like. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. And that wholeness isn't given by a church or a ritual or a doctrine. It's built from the inside out, through therapy, through community, through honest reflection, through small acts of self-trust. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it hurts, but it's real, and it's worth it. Because no one should feel like they have to earn their worth. No one should feel like they need to fear their own thoughts. No one should be taught that their value is tied to obedience. And yet, millions were. But now, they're unlearning, reclaiming, healing, one voice at a time. And sometimes that healing doesn't look dramatic. It's not a loud declaration, it's not a single moment of transformation. More often it looks like subtle shifts over time. Someone stops apologizing for setting boundaries. They allow themselves to say no without guilt. They feel a wave of panic after breaking an old rule, but this time they don't give in to it. They breathe. They move forward. That's recovery, and recovery isn't linear. There are setbacks, triggers, moments when the old programming flares up again, maybe during a family visit, maybe in the middle of a conversation, maybe after a random memory. But the difference is, now they recognize it. They don't see their reaction as proof that something's wrong with them. They see it as evidence of how deep the conditioning went and how far they've already come. Because once you understand religious trauma, the pieces start to fall into place. The perfectionism, the fear of disappointing others, the inability to rest, the guilt that appears without cause, the constant pressure to be pure or worthy or good enough. These aren't character flaws. They're symptoms of a system that taught people to fear being human. And when that system is removed, there's space for something new. A life built not on fear of punishment, but on genuine curiosity. Not on obedience, but on understanding. Not on shame, but on compassion. And not just for others, for yourself. Self-compassion is often the last thing to arrive, because religion rarely teaches it. In many traditions, you're taught to put yourself last, to die to self, to be small, to be invisible, to see your desires as distractions, your instincts as temptations. But healing requires the opposite. It requires listening to yourself, trusting yourself, allowing joy even when it doesn't serve a higher cause, allowing rest even when it isn't productive, allowing sadness even when you're told to rejoice always. That kind of self-trust can feel selfish at first, but it's not. It's survival, because the parts of you that were shut down, the questions, the doubts, the boundaries, those are the very parts that need to come back online for healing to happen. They're not signs of rebellion, they're signs of life. And once people see that, they stop seeing their recovery as a moral failure. They stop seeing their departure from religion as a loss of purpose. They stop framing their trauma as their own fault. And they start to recognize the systems that shaped them, systems that told them love was conditional, that their body was property, that suffering was noble, that silence was holy, that their value came from obedience, not from existence. When you've been taught that long enough, even freedom feels threatening. But with time, that threat fades, and what replaces it isn't just comfort, it's clarity. A clarity that lets people say, I was hurt by ideas that were presented as truth. I was shaped by fear disguised as morality. I was taught to distrust the very parts of me that are most human. But I'm not stuck there anymore. That clarity leads to courage. And courage leads to connection. Because once people start speaking openly about their experience, others begin to respond. Quietly at first, cautiously, but they respond. They say, I thought I was the only one, or I still flinch when I hear those words, or I haven't believed for years, but I still feel like I'm being watched. That's not coincidence, that's pattern. And once we name the pattern, we can begin to heal it, not by demonizing those who believe, but by recognizing the cost of systems that punish thought, pathologize identity, and equate suffering with virtue. People can believe what they want, but when belief leads to trauma, it has to be talked about. And it's being talked about now more than ever. In online communities, in therapy rooms, in podcasts and videos and quiet conversations between friends who've never said the words out loud. There's a shift happening, a growing awareness that trauma doesn't just come from violence, it can come from the doctrines we were raised in, the rules we couldn't question, the threats we couldn't see, and that trauma deserves the same compassion, the same care, the same validation as any other. Because pain is pain, fear is fear, and healing is possible. And the more that healing becomes possible, the more it becomes visible. You start to see it in the way people carry themselves, in how they speak, how they listen, how they begin to reconnect with parts of themselves they thought they had to suppress. You hear it in the shift from fear to curiosity, from confession to reflection, from rigidity to exploration. You see people taking ownership of their minds again, choosing their values instead of inheriting them, asking better questions instead of repeating the answers they were given. And it's not that everything becomes easy, or that the scars disappear, but the fear begins to lose its grip. That voice that once whispered, "You're broken," starts to fade, and a new voice takes its place, not louder, but clearer. One that says, "You're learning, you're allowed to grow. You don't need to be perfect to be worthy." That voice doesn't come from outside, it comes from inside, from the part of you that always knew something wasn't right, even if you couldn't explain why, the part that kept asking questions, even when you were told not to, the part that stayed alive. And when that voice finally gets heard, something starts to shift. People begin to redefine what strength means, not as obedience, not as silence, but as resilience, as the ability to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, to ask for help even when it feels shameful, to be kind to yourself even when you've been trained not to be. And they start to build lives that aren't defined by fear. They create families that don't revolve around guilt, friendships that don't rely on shared belief, communities that aren't based on sameness but on support. They find purpose in things that don't require divine approval, in learning, in care, in creativity, in presence. And they learn to love without strings attached, because they've seen what conditional love looks like, and they've chosen something better. That choice isn't easy. It comes with loss, with grief, sometimes with distance from the people who once defined your world. But it also comes with peace, with the quiet realization that you are not wrong for wanting to be whole, and that recovery isn't betrayal, it's survival. People don't talk about this enough, because talking about religious trauma is uncomfortable. It challenges deeply held assumptions. It questions things people were told they're not allowed to question. But that discomfort is necessary, because silence protects systems, not people. And when those systems cause harm, they need to be examined. Not out of bitterness, out of responsibility. Because people deserve to grow up without fear of eternal punishment. They deserve to think without shame, to feel without judgment, to explore without being told they're broken for wondering. They deserve lives that are rooted in reality, not in fear of the afterlife. And more they're choosing that. They're letting go of ideas that once held them hostage. They're naming what was done to them. They're speaking up, not to attack belief, but to defend healing. And that's powerful, because healing from religious trauma doesn't require destroying religion. It requires creating space for honesty, for people to say, what happened to me wasn't okay, and I don't have to carry it forever. That sentence alone can change a life. And those lives are changing, slowly, quietly, all over the world, not just because people are walking away from religion, but because they're walking towards something better, a way of living that doesn't demand fear in exchange for love, that doesn't frame pain as growth, that doesn't turn shame into a virtue, a way of living that says you are allowed to exist fully, without apology. And that message, simple as it is reaching people not through preaching, not through doctrine, but through stories, shared openly, honestly, without fear. That's where healing starts, and that's how it spreads. Not by force, but by truth. And once that truth is spoken, it's very hard to silence again. Because people who have faced their fear and stepped through it don't go back to pretending. They move forward, slowly, together. And the silence becomes conversation, and conversation becomes healing, and healing becomes freedom. That's what recovery from religious trauma really looks like. It's not the end of something, in the beginning.